So let's talk about something really fascinating in Islamic theology. God's throne, the Arsh, and his footstool, the Kursi. When you hear those words, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably a literal, physical seat of power up in the cosmos somewhere, right? Well, it turns out some of the most foundational sources point to something much, much deeper. A profound metaphorical meaning. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. You've probably heard this line before, right? It's from the verse of the throne. It just paints this incredible cosmic picture of a footstool, a Kursi, stretching over all of creation. It's this image of just immense scale and power. And honestly, it's the perfect jumping-off point for our whole discussion. All right, let's get right to the heart of it, because this is the big question. Islamic tradition is crystal clear that God is utterly transcendent, completely beyond our physical world. No body, not limited by space or time. So what gives? How do we square that with language that sounds like we're describing actual physical objects? That's the puzzle we're here to piece together by looking closely at the texts. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at where these ideas even come from in the scriptures. Then, we'll dive into the big debate. Are we talking literal objects or powerful metaphors? After that, we'll explore what they actually symbolize, these huge concepts like knowledge and dominion. We'll also see how the throne and footstool stack up against each other. And finally, we'll tie it all together to see what this really means for how we understand God. All right, first things first. To really get a handle on this, we've got to go back to the source. Where do we even get these concepts of a throne and a footstool? Let's dig into the texts themselves. So, it all goes back to the Quran. The words Arsh and Kursi, they're right there in the foundational scripture. So the question isn't whether they exist in the text. That's a given. The real question is, what do they actually mean? And that, my friends, is where the deep dive, the real forensic work of interpretation truly begins. And boom, that brings us right to the core issue. When we're talking about the throne and footstool, are we imagining actual physical objects, like cosmic furniture? Or is there something way, way more profound going on here? So you've basically got two camps clashing here. On one side, you have the literal interpretation of physical throne for God. But that gets you into some really tricky theological waters, because you start imagining God in a human-like form, a concept called anthropomorphism. But then you have the other view, the one our sources are all about. It argues that, no, these are powerful symbols, metaphors for God's abstract qualities, which keeps the core idea of his complete transcendence totally intact. So yeah, are we talking about cosmic furniture or something else entirely? The scholars we're digging into, they asked this exact question. And their answer? It's a hard pivot away from the physical and straight into the world of ideas, into the conceptual. Let's see what they found. Okay, now this is where it gets really, really cool. The source texts basically hand us a key that completely unlocks a different way of seeing the throne and the footstool. Forget physical objects. We're talking about these incredible metaphors for God's most fundamental attributes. So, you ready for it? Here's the big reveal. The Arsh, the throne, isn't a chair. It's not a place where God sits. According to this interpretation, it is the ultimate symbol for his perfect, all-encompassing knowledge, his ʿilm. We're talking about an intellect so vast, so complete, that it literally contains everything within it. And it's the same story for the Kursi, the footstool. Again, not a physical thing, but a metaphor, this time for God's dominion, his mulk. Think of it as his absolute power and authority that stretches over the entire universe, from a single atom to the most distant galaxy. It's the tangible expression of his power in the created world. But why? Why use these metaphors at all? Well, the sources have a pretty good explanation. It's basically about the limits of our own language. I mean, how do you describe something that's infinite and non-physical? You can't, not really. So you reach for things you do understand, like a throne, a symbol of power, to try and get your mind around a reality that's just beyond words. It's not a literal description. It's a bridge for our minds. Okay, so we've established these two huge metaphors. But what's the relationship between them? It's not about two objects sitting side by side. No, there's a definite structure here, a clear hierarchy of these immense concepts. And the texts are super clear on this point. The Arsh is greater than the Kursi, period. The symbol for God's absolute knowledge is conceptually bigger and more all-encompassing than the symbol for his rule over the universe he created. And let's break that down. First, you've got the Kursi.
God's dominion. It includes everything we can possibly imagine, the heavens, the earth, the whole shebang. And that alone is mind-bendingly vast. But then you have the Arsh, God's knowledge, which is even greater. Why? Because it actually contains the Kursi itself. Just let that sink in for a second. It means that all of creation doesn't just exist for God to know about. It exists inside the very fabric of his knowledge.
To really help us wrap our heads around this impossible scale, the commentaries give us this amazing analogy. Picture the entire universe, everything within the Kursi, as a single, tiny ring, like a wedding band. Now, imagine you toss that ring into a vast, endless desert. That desert is the Arsh, God's knowledge. The entire universe is just this tiny, almost insignificant speck lost in that desert. The scale is meant to feel impossible for us to fully grasp, and that's the whole point.
So what? Why does all this matter? Why is it so important to see these concepts as metaphors instead of literal objects? Well, because it fundamentally changes how we think about the very nature of God. This is really the payoff. Thinking this way reinforces that God is absolutely transcendent, totally non-physical. It pushes us away from thinking of God in human terms. It makes us appreciate the deep, symbolic language in the scriptures, and really, it elevates our whole understanding from the literal, from stuff, to the conceptual, to ideas. It means we define God not by a physical form, but by these infinite concepts, boundless knowledge, and absolute power.
So here's the bottom line. When you think about the throne of God, the Arsh, don't picture a piece of furniture in the sky. Instead, think of it as the ultimate symbol of an all-encompassing absolute knowledge, a knowledge so complete that nothing is absent from it, a knowledge that holds and sustains everything that ever was, is, or will be.
And that leaves us with something to chew on, doesn't it? We've just seen how these powerful scriptural images can be unlocked as these profound metaphors. It makes you wonder, whenever we try to speak of something infinite, do we have to rely on symbols? How much of our understanding of the divine is shaped not just by our beliefs, but by the very limits and possibilities of the words we use? It's something to think about.